Silent Codes. The Mathematical War Beneath the Battles, November 18, 1941. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. Captain Alan Turing stared at a matrix of seemingly random characters, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced cryptographic patterns that would transform the mathematics of warfare. The Germans believed their Enigma machine created an unbreakable code. A cryptographic fortress that would guarantee their strategic communications remained impenetrable. What they did not understand was that they were witnessing the birth of a systematic revolution that would be written not in battle strategies, but in mathematical permutations and probability. The mathematics of this war would be calculated in code-breaking rooms where ordinary people performed extraordinary intellectual feats, where the ability to see patterns where others saw chaos would determine the fate of nations. This was not a war decided solely by soldiers, but by mathematicians, linguists, and engineers who understood that information was the most potent weapon of all. The roots of calculation. The foundations of this cryptographic warfare were laid long before the first shots were fired. The roots stretched back to the Great War of 1914-1918, where primitive code-breaking efforts had first revealed the strategic potential of signals intelligence. Military leaders who had dismissed cryptanalysis as an academic exercise would learn through brutal experience that wars were increasingly won and lost through the control and manipulation of information. By 1939, as Nazi Germany began its systematic conquest of Europe, the mathematics of cryptography had evolved into a complex, high-stakes intellectual battlefield. The German Enigma machine represented the pinnacle of cryptographic technology, a device that transformed messages through an intricate system of rotors and electrical connections, creating billions of possible code combinations. Each message sent through the Enigma was a mathematical puzzle that seemed unsolvable. The Polish mathematicians. The first breakthrough came not from British intelligence, but from Polish cryptanalysts who had been studying German communication methods since the early 1930s. Marian Rejewski, a mathematician working for Polish military intelligence, had developed revolutionary techniques for decoding Enigma messages. Using advanced mathematical principles and an understanding of machine logic that was decades ahead of his contemporaries, Rejewski created mechanical devices called bombs that could simulate Enigma's complex encryption processes. When Poland fell to German invasion in 1939, Rejewski's team escaped, bringing with them not just their research, but actual Enigma machines and decryption techniques. They transferred their knowledge to British and French intelligence, providing the critical foundation that would enable the Allied signals intelligence effort. Bletchley Park, the hidden factory of intellect. Bletchley Park became the epicenter of this intellectual warfare. Housed in an unassuming manor in Buckinghamshire, it assembled a group of Britain's most brilliant minds, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and crossword puzzle experts. Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician with a revolutionary understanding of computational theory, became the strategic architect of the code-breaking effort. Turing's approach was fundamentally different from traditional cryptanalysis. Where others saw an impenetrable code, he saw a mathematical system with inherent weaknesses. The Enigma machine, for all its complexity, was ultimately a mechanical device with predictable patterns. Its very complexity became its vulnerability. The team at Bletchley Park developed increasingly sophisticated electromechanical computers designed specifically to decode Enigma transmissions. The bomb, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of potential rotor settings per minute, represented a quantum leap in computational technology. What would have taken human analysts years could now be accomplished in hours. The human element. Behind these mathematical marvels were extraordinary individuals whose personal stories revealed the human drama of signals intelligence. Joan Clark, a brilliant mathematician who worked closely with Turing, navigated a male-dominated environment with exceptional skill. Despite facing systematic gender discrimination, she became a crucial member of the decryption team, her mathematical insights proving as sharp as any of her male colleagues. Personal testimonies. Gordon Welchman, another key mathematician at Bletchley Park, later recalled the psychological intensity of their work. We understood that every second mattered. Each message we decoded could save thousands of lives, could alter the trajectory of entire military campaigns. We were not just solving mathematical puzzles. We were fighting a war through pure intellect. The Pacific Theater. Breaking Japanese naval codes. While the European theater saw the dramatic breaking of the Enigma, the Pacific War presented its own cryptographic challenges. The Japanese naval codes, particularly the JN-25 system, represented an entirely different cryptographic landscape. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the U.S. Navy's cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor, a group of mathematicians and linguists who would play a pivotal role in the Pacific campaign. Their breakthrough came not through brute computational power, but through an intricate understanding of Japanese communication patterns and linguistic structures. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 represented the ultimate vindication of signals intelligence. By successfully decoding Japanese naval communications, American forces were able to anticipate and ultimately destroy a significant portion of the Japanese carrier fleet, a moment that transformed the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War. The mathematical weapons, the true power of signals intelligence lay not just in decoding individual messages, but in understanding entire communication systems. By comprehending German and Japanese communication protocols, Allied forces could do more than read messages. They could manipulate enemy perceptions, feed false information, and create elaborate strategic deceptions. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate British deception campaign preceding the D-Day invasion, relied heavily on signals intelligence. By feeding false information through carefully monitored communication channels, the Allies convinced German High Command that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, a deception that saved thousands of Allied lives. The legacy of calculation. The work done at Bletchley Park and in similar signals intelligence centers around the world represented more than a military achievement. It was a profound demonstration of how pure intellectual capability could transform warfare. The computational techniques developed during World War II would go on to become the foundation of modern computer science. Alan Turing, who played a pivotal role in breaking the Enigma, would later become a foundational figure in computer science. The very machines developed to break Nazi codes would evolve into the first computational devices, transforming not just warfare, but human technological capability. Conclusion: the invisible battlefield. In the end, World War II was fought on multiple battlefields: the beaches of Normandy, the islands of the Pacific, the skies over Europe. But the most decisive battles were often invisible, fought by individuals wielding mathematical equations instead of guns, solving puzzles that would determine the fate of nations. The story of signals intelligence is ultimately a story of human potential. It proves that in moments of existential challenge, the most powerful weapon is not technological superiority, but the ability to perceive patterns where others see only chaos. The mathematicians, linguists, and engineers who broke these codes were not just solving puzzles. They were rewriting the fundamental understanding of human intellectual capability. They transformed warfare from a contest of physical might to a complex, multi-dimensional chess match where information was the most potent weapon. In doing so, they demonstrated an eternal truth: that human ingenuity, when systematically organized and focused, can achieve what seems impossible. The codes were broken, the war was won, and the world was forever changed. Metal and mathematics, How the Sherman Tank Rewrote the Rules of Modern Warfare, January 15, 1943, outside Stalingrad. Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Andreevich Kozlov squinted through the frozen periscope of his T-34, watching the burning remnants of yet another German panzer division. His fingers, calloused from countless battles, traced the scars of combat across his tank's hull. The Germans believed they possessed the ultimate weapon. They were wrong. The true revolution was happening thousands of kilometers away, in factories that were transforming industrial production into a weapon more devastating than any single tank could be. This was not a battle decided by individual machines, but by the systematic transformation of industrial capacity. The mathematics of this war would be calculated in production lines, in assembly techniques that would shatter every assumption about manufacturing limits, about national industrial potential, about the very nature of mechanized warfare. The roots of industrial transformation. The foundations of this technological revolution stretched back to the desperate days of 1941, when the Soviet Union absorbed the most brutal invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks in the first 6 months, leaving the Red Army bleeding and seemingly defenseless. Traditional military analysts predicted the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. What they did not understand was that the Soviet system was about to demonstrate something unprecedented: the ability to completely reconstruct an industrial base while under direct military assault. The American response would become the most significant industrial achievement of the 20th century. The Sherman tank, derided initially by Soviet tankers as a weak, thin-skinned machine, would become the mathematical instrument that would help dismantle Hitler's war machine. The industrial battlefield. By 1942, the Soviet Union had accomplished something that defied all military logic. They had not just survived the German invasion, but had begun to move entire industrial complexes thousands of kilometers east of the front lines. Factories from Ukraine and Belarus were being reassembled in the Ural Mountains, in Siberia, in Kazakhstan, regions so vast and inhospitable that the Germans had never conceived they could serve as an industrial base. These weren't just relocations. They were complete industrial transformations. Entire manufacturing ecosystems were being rebuilt, retooled, and repurposed with a speed that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Workers who had been civilians weeks earlier were now producing tanks, artillery, and weapons with an efficiency that would shock the world. The Soviet perspective. Initial skepticism. When the first American Lend-Lease Sherman tanks arrived in the Soviet Union, they were met with profound skepticism. Soviet tank crews, hardened by the brutal combat against German panzers, initially mocked the American machine. Compared to the T-34, a tank that had already become legendary for its combination of firepower, mobility, and robust design, the Sherman seemed almost comically inadequate. Captain Dmitry Lavrinenko, a decorated tank commander who would become one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated tank aces, initially wrote in his war diary, "These American tanks are a joke, thin armor, a gun. That seems more suited to a hunting rifle than a battle. The Germans will laugh when they see these." But the Shermans would prove something far more important than individual combat performance. They would demonstrate the true power of industrial systemization. The mathematics of production. Why Soviet and German tanks were handcrafted with incredible skill, the Sherman was designed for mass production. Where a German Panther tank required 300,000 labor hours to construct, a Sherman could be built in just 55,000 hours. More critically, the Americans were producing Shermans faster than the Germans could destroy them. By 1944, the United States was producing over 2,000 tanks per month. Germany, struggling under Allied bombing and resource constraints, could barely manufacture 300. The tank was no longer just a weapon of war. It had become a statistical weapon, a mathematical instrument of industrial warfare. Personal testimonies. The transformation, Sergeant Viktor Nikolaevich Belousov, who would eventually command a mixed unit of T-34s and Shermans, recalled the moment of realization. We didn't love the Sherman at first, but we learned to respect what it represented. These were not just tanks. They were proof of something larger, that industrial capacity could be a weapon more powerful than any single piece of equipment. The technological innovation. The Sherman represented a radical departure from traditional tank design. Instead of pursuing the path of maximum armor and firepower, the German approach, the Americans had created a tank designed for reliability, ease of production, and rapid battlefield replacement. Its electrical systems were standardized, its components were modular. A damaged Sherman could be repaired in hours, often using parts from other vehicles. Where a German Panther might require weeks of specialized repair, a Sherman could be back in combat within a day. The Pacific and European theaters. In the Pacific, Marines would use Shermans in amphibious landings. In Europe, they would serve alongside British and Canadian forces. But it was in the Soviet theater that the Sherman would prove most revolutionary. By 1944, Soviet tank units were receiving not just tanks, but a complete logistics system. Each Sherman arrived with spare parts, maintenance manuals, and a level of industrial support that was revolutionary. The Americans weren't just sending tanks. They were sending an entire industrial philosophy. The legacy of industrial warfare. When the war concluded, the numbers told a story more powerful than any individual battle narrative. The United States had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. The Soviet Union had manufactured 84,000 T-34 tanks. Germany, by contrast, had produced just over 49,000 tanks of all types. These weren't just machines. They were the physical manifestation of an industrial strategy that would reshape global manufacturing for decades to come. Conclusion. Beyond the battlefield, the Sherman tank represents more than a military vehicle. It is a testament to a fundamental truth about industrial capability, that systematic thinking, modular design, and the ability to mass produce with precision can transform seemingly insurmountable challenges. Soviet tank crews who had initially mocked the Sherman would, by war's end, recognize it as a crucial instrument of victory. Not because it was the most technologically advanced tank, but because it represented a new way of thinking about industrial production. The tanks themselves would mostly be scrapped or forgotten, but the industrial philosophy they represented, that quantity, when combined with intelligent design, could overcome individual technical limitations, would echo across decades of technological development. The mathematics of victory were written not just in battlefield statistics, but in production lines, in modular designs, in the systematic transformation of industrial capacity. The Sherman didn't just help win a war. It rewrote the fundamental understanding of what was possible in industrial production. February 7th, 1943. 18 kilometers west of Stalingrad, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrovich Zhukov pressed his face against the frozen periscope of his damaged T-34, watching the burning wreckage of 3 German Panzer IVs scattered across the snow-covered steppe. His hands, trembling not from cold but from a realization that would echo across military history, traced the scars on his tank's battle-worn hull. These Americans, with their strange box-like Sherman tanks, did not understand warfare. Or so the Soviet tank commanders had believed. They did not fight like other tanks. The Germans had promised that the Americans' tanks were weak, thin-skinned, a joke. Zhukov had repeated those words himself, laughing with his fellow tankers during briefings. Yet here, in the brutal mathematics of combat, something impossible was happening. The Sherman tanks that Soviet crews had initially mocked were doing something that contradicted every assumption about mechanized warfare. 3 German tanks destroyed, 0 Soviet losses, and the Americans were just getting started. The roots of this transformation lay 3 years earlier, in the desperate summer of 1940, when the world teetered on the precipice of total war. The mathematics of industrial capability were being written not in strategic plans, but in the fundamental reimagining of how nations could produce weapons of war. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. In the first 6 months, the Soviet Union would lose 20,541 tanks, 21,200 aircraft, and over 4 million soldiers. Military analysts across the world predicted the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. The Red Army was bleeding, seemingly defenseless against the most sophisticated military machine ever assembled. What none of them understood was that the Soviet system was about to demonstrate something unprecedented in military history: the ability to completely reconstruct an industrial base while simultaneously fighting the most brutal defensive war ever witnessed. By December 1941, as German tanks approached Moscow, Soviet factories were already in motion, not retreating, not surrendering, but moving. Entire manufacturing complexes, thousands of workers, millions of tons of machinery were being transported thousands of kilometers east, beyond the Ural Mountains, into the vast, inhospitable regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Regions so remote that German military planners had never conceived they could serve as an industrial base. These were not simple relocations. These were systematic industrial revolutions happening in real time, under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Factories that had been producing peacetime consumer goods were retooling to produce tanks in weeks. Workers who had been civilians mere months earlier were now precision machinists, welders, and industrial engineers. The Americans were watching. And in Detroit, Michigan, something equally revolutionary was taking shape. The Republic Steel Corporation and Ford Motor Company were about to transform tank production in ways that would shatter every assumption about industrial manufacturing. Where European manufacturers saw tanks as handcrafted instruments of war, the Americans saw them as products to be mass-produced with the same logic applied to automobiles. Alexander Winton, founder of the Winton Engine Company and an early automotive pioneer, had once famously declared that automobiles could never be mass-produced like consumer goods. Henry Ford had proven him wrong. Now, the same philosophy would be applied to tank manufacturing, with consequences that would reshape the entire understanding of industrial warfare. The Sherman tank represented more than a weapon. It was a systematic approach to industrial production, a mathematical solution to the complex problem of equipping a global military campaign. Where European tank designs pursued individual technical perfection, the Americans pursued a radically different strategy: reliability, ease of production, and the ability to replace losses quickly. By 1942, the production mathematics were becoming clear. A German Panther tank required 300,000 labor hours to construct. A Soviet T-34 needed approximately 250,000 hours. The American Sherman, just 55,000 hours. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real revolution was happening in the fundamental approach to manufacturing. The Soviet Union and the United States were about to prove that in modern warfare, industrial capacity was not just a supporting factor. It was the decisive weapon. The tanks themselves were merely the physical manifestation of a deeper, more profound transformation in how nations conceived of industrial production. Spirit versus material, the psychological warfare of tank design. Captain Leonid Osipov, a veteran tank commander who had survived the brutal fighting around Kursk, understood something profound about modern warfare that went beyond simple mechanical specifications. In a rare moment of reflection, recorded in his post-war memoirs, he articulated a truth that would echo through military history. "We were taught that Soviet spirit could overcome any material limitation," Osipov wrote. The Germans believed the same about their engineering. What the Americans proved was that spirit and material, when properly synchronized, were unbeatable. This was not just a philosophical observation, it was a mathematical revelation about the nature of modern combat, where industrial capacity became as crucial as individual courage. Tactical mythology versus industrial reality. The German military doctrine had long celebrated the individual tank as a supreme weapon of war. The Panther and Tiger tanks were crafted with almost religious devotion to technical perfection. Each was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring enormous resources and incredible skill to produce. By contrast, the Sherman represented a completely different philosophy. Major General Jacob Devers, who oversaw American armored force development, described it bluntly. "We are not building museum pieces. We are building weapons of war that can be replaced faster than they can be destroyed." Personal testimony. Sergeant Mikhail Borodin, who commanded a mixed unit of T-34s and Shermans during the Battle of Kursk, recalled the first time he truly understood this principle. "I watched a Sherman take multiple hits that would have destroyed a T-34. But instead of being precious about survival, the crew simply abandoned the tank, and another rolled up to take its place. This was not cowardice. This was industrial mathematics." Old methods versus innovation. The production paradigm. The traditional approach to tank manufacturing saw each vehicle as a unique artifact. German and Soviet factories treated tank production like crafting a precision instrument. The American approach was radically different. Ford Motor Company, leveraging its automotive assembly line techniques, transformed tank production into a systematized process. Where a German tank might require specialized craftsmen working for months, a Sherman could be assembled by workers with minimal training using interchangeable parts. Engineer Albert Wooding, who worked in one of the primary Sherman production facilities, described the transformation. "We weren't building tanks. We were creating a standardized product, like an automobile. Every component was designed for rapid replacement, for scalability." Training versus adaptability. The human element, Soviet military training emphasized individual heroism and technical mastery. German training focused on tactical brilliance. The American approach prioritized adaptability and systematic training. Lieutenant Colonel George Byers, who supervised Sherman tank crew training, developed a revolutionary approach. "We are not training tank crews," he would tell new recruits. "We are creating an organic system where the human is just another interchangeable component." Personal testimony. Private First Class. James Henderson, a young tank driver from Michigan, remembered his training. "They taught us not to be attached to the machine. If the tank was damaged, you got out, you survived. Another tank took your place. We were part of a larger system, not individual heroes." Technology versus logistics, the invisible weapon. While tank designers focused on armor and firepower, the Americans understood that logistics were the true decisive factor in modern warfare. Each Sherman came with a complete support ecosystem, maintenance manuals, spare parts, repair techniques. The tank was more than a weapon. It was a complete industrial solution. Commander Vasily Krylov, a Soviet liaison officer who worked closely with American tank units, was initially skeptical but became a convert. The Germans and we saw tanks as individual warriors. The Americans saw them as nodes in a larger logistical network. This was the real revolution. Quantity versus quality, the mathematical transformation. The numbers told a story more powerful than any individual battle narrative. By 1944, the United States was producing 2,000 tanks per month. Germany, struggling under Allied bombing, could barely manufacture 300. Personal testimony. Major Nikolai Volkov, who analyzed captured German intelligence reports after the war, discovered something profound. The German reports showed increasing panic, not about individual tank performances, but about the mathematical impossibility of matching American production rates. The industrial ecosystem. Beyond the tank. The Sherman represented more than a military vehicle. It was a complete industrial philosophy. Modular design, standardized components, rapid training protocols, these were weapons as significant as the tank's cannon. Personal testimony. Dr. Elena Petrova, a Soviet industrial economist who studied post-war manufacturing, reflected, "The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a blueprint for how modern industrial systems could function. Flexibility, standardization, a rapid adaptation. Survival versus replacement. The ultimate tactical advantage." Where Soviet and German tanks were treated as irreplaceable assets, the Sherman was designed with calculated redundancy. Losing a tank was not a tragedy. It was a statistically anticipated outcome. Captain Ivan Chernikov, a tank battalion commander, grudgingly admitted after the war, "The Americans understood something we did not. In total war, the ability to replace is more important than the ability to survive." The final calculation. By war's end, the United States had produced 49,234 Shermans. The Soviet Union had manufactured 84,110 T-34 tanks. Germany had produced just 49,000 tanks of all types. These weren't just machines. They were mathematical instruments that had transformed the very understanding of industrial warfare. The final synthesis, rewriting the mathematics of war. The victory was sealed not on the battlefields of Kursk or Stalingrad, but in the factories of Detroit, Gorky, and Magnitogorsk. General Georgy Zhukov, standing on the reviewing stand in Berlin during the Victory Parade of 1945, understood something profound that went beyond military triumph. The tanks that had won the war represented more than a weapon. They were a complete transformation of human industrial potential. The Sherman tank entered the war as an object of derision and left it as the physical manifestation of an entirely new approach to industrial warfare. Japanese, German, and Soviet military analysts would spend decades studying not just the tank's specifications, but the systematic approach that had made its production possible. Captured German intelligence reports, analyzed in the decades following the war, revealed a consistent theme. The Reich's military planners had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They believed in the supremacy of individual technical perfection. The Americans had proven that systematic production, combined with engineering flexibility, was the ultimate weapon. The statistical record was unequivocal. The United States produced 49,234 Shermans. The Soviet Union manufactured 84,110 T-34 tanks. Germany produced just 49,000 tanks of all types. But the numbers told only part of the story. Each Sherman represented more than a military vehicle. It was a complete industrial philosophy, a systematic approach to manufacturing that would reshape global industrial practices for decades to come. Major General Jacob Devers, reflecting on the tank's legacy in a 1950 military journal, captured the essential truth. "We did not win the war with better tanks," he wrote. "We won by transforming the very concept of industrial production. The Sherman was not a weapon. It was a mathematical solution to the problem of modern warfare." The lessons learned in those factory lines would echo far beyond the battlefields of World War II. The modular design approach, the systematic training protocols, the understanding that industrial capacity could be a weapon more powerful than individual technical brilliance. These were the true legacy of the Sherman tank. At the United States Army Ordnance Museum in Aberdeen, Maryland, a restored Sherman sits among other legendary weapons. Its placard lists technical specifications, weight, armament, speed. But the real story is told in the subtle details. The standardized components, the simplified maintenance protocols, the design that prioritized rapid production over individual perfection. Captured German and Soviet tank commanders would later acknowledge a truth that had been invisible during the war. The Americans had not just built a tank, they had created a systematic approach to industrial warfare that made individual technical superiority irrelevant. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Guderian, the legendary German tank theorist interviewed in 1955, provided a stark assessment. "We believed in the supremacy of the individual warrior," he said. "The Americans understood that modern warfare is a mathematical equation. Quantity, when combined with intelligent design, will always overcome individual technical limitations." This was the enduring legacy of the Sherman tank. It proved that human potential is not limited by traditional assumptions. That systematic thinking, when applied to industrial production, can transform seemingly insurmountable challenges into routine solutions. The tanks themselves would mostly be scrapped or forgotten. Museums would display a few as historical curiosities, but the industrial philosophy they represented would reshape manufacturing across industries, across decades. The mathematics of victory were written not in battle strategies, but in production lines, in modular designs, in the systematic transformation of industrial capacity. The Sherman didn't just help win a war, it rewrote the fundamental understanding of what was possible in industrial production. Against such an approach, individual technical brilliance was never going to be enough. The war was lost before the first shot was fired. In the factories, in the design rooms, in the systematic reimagining of industrial potential. The Mathematics of War, 8 Untold Stories of World War II. Section 1, The Iron Road, Soviet Railway Logistics and the Mathematics of Movement, October 12, 1941, Moscow Railway Command Center. Colonel Dmitry Vasilyevich Pavlov stared at a map that showed something impossible. 300 trains, moving simultaneously, carrying entire factories, millions of tons of machinery, and over 1.5 million workers eastward, all while the German Wehrmacht advanced toward Moscow at 40 kilometers per day. The Germans believed the Soviet Union was collapsing. They were watching the largest logistical operation in human history. This was not retreat. This was transformation. The mathematics of this operation would be calculated not in battlefield victories, but in railway schedules, in the systematic coordination of transportation networks across 11 time zones, in the ability to move an entire industrial civilization while simultaneously fighting the most brutal defensive war ever witnessed. The foundation of Soviet logistics. The roots of Soviet railway supremacy stretched back to the 1930s, when Stalin's industrialization campaigns had created the most extensive railway network in the world. By 1941, the Soviet Union operated over 106,000 kilometers of track, more than any nation except the United States. But the real advantage was not in distance, it was in the systematic approach to railway operations. Soviet railway doctrine, developed by Transport Commissar Lazar Kaganovich, treated railways not as simple transportation infrastructure, but as a weapon of war. Every major industrial complex was connected by multiple rail lines. Every major city had redundant connections. The system was designed to survive catastrophic damage and continue functioning. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, this system faced its ultimate test. The Great Relocation, an industrial exodus. Between July and December 1941, the Soviet Union accomplished something that military historians still struggle to comprehend. They relocated 1,523 industrial enterprises, including 1,360 major war factories, from Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia to the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. This was not a simple evacuation. It was a complete industrial transplantation. Engineer Alexei Kosygin, who coordinated much of this effort, later described the scale. "We were not just moving factories. We were moving entire industrial ecosystems. The workers, their families, the machinery, the raw materials, the expertise, everything had to move as a coordinated system." The mathematics were staggering. Each major factory required an average of 40-60 trains to relocate. The Kharkov tank factory alone needed 8,000 railway cars. The Kirov plant in Leningrad required over 10,000. And all of this was happening while the same railway network was simultaneously moving 5.5 million soldiers and their equipment to the front lines. Personal testimony. Railway worker Yekaterina Mikhailovna. Yekaterina Mikhailovna Sokolova worked as a dispatcher at the Gorky Railway Junction during this period. Her memoir, published in 1975, provides extraordinary insight into the human dimension of this logistical miracle. We understood that every train that arrived late could mean the difference between victory and defeat, she wrote. I worked 18-hour shifts, 7 days a week, for 4 months straight. We all did. Sleep was a luxury we could not afford. Her records show that the Gorky Junction processed an average of 47 trains per day during the peak evacuation period, a rate that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Trains were scheduled with military precision, often just 15 minutes apart on single-track lines. Any delay cascaded through the entire system. The technical revolution Soviet railway engineers developed innovations that would transform logistics operations. They created standardized loading protocols that could reduce factory disassembly and loading time from weeks to days. They developed new scheduling algorithms that maximized track utilization while minimizing collision risks. Chief Engineer Boris Shaposhnikov implemented a revolutionary signaling system that allowed trains to operate at night without lights, crucial for avoiding German air attacks. His team created a system of audible signals and mechanical flags that could guide trains through complete darkness. The system worked through brutal efficiency. Trains that broke down were pushed off the tracks immediately. Damaged sections of a rail were replaced within hours using prefabricated segments stored at regular intervals. The entire network operated as a single adaptive organism. Winter operations. The ultimate test. The winter of 1941 to 1942 tested the system beyond any reasonable limit. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees Celsius. Fuel froze. Locomotives seized. And still, the trains moved. Railway workers developed emergency protocols that seem almost mythical. They learned to keep locomotives running continuously, never allowing them to stop long enough for the fuel to freeze. They created portable heating systems using wood-fired boilers. They invented new lubrication techniques using animal fats when petroleum-based oils failed. Personal testimony. Locomotive engineer Ivan Petrov. Ivan Petrov operated freight trains on the Trans-Siberian route during the winter of 1941. His account provides visceral detail about the conditions these railway workers faced. We could not stop, he recalled. To stop meant death. For us, for the locomotive, for the entire convoy we were part of. I once operated a train for 62 hours straight without rest. From Omsk to Novosibirsk. My hands were frozen to the controls. When we finally arrived, they had to pry my fingers loose. Petrov's convoy carried critical machine tools from the relocated Kharkov factory. The tools arrived on schedule. Within 3 weeks, they were producing T-34 tanks in their new Siberian location. The strategic impact. By December 1941, when the relocated factories began production in their new locations, the Germans believed they had destroyed Soviet industrial capacity. They were catastrophically wrong. Production statistics tell the story. Tank production. Despite losing major manufacturing centers, Soviet tank production actually increased from 6,590 tanks in 1941 to 24,446 in 1942. Aircraft production increased from 15,735 planes in 1941 to 25,436 in 1942. Artillery production increased from 42,300 pieces in 1941 to 127,000 in 1942. These numbers were impossible according to traditional military logistics theory. The Germans had captured or destroyed the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union. By all conventional analysis, Soviet production should have collapsed. The railway system had made the impossible routine. Comparative analysis. German railway operations. The German railway system, despite its reputation for efficiency, operated on fundamentally different principles. German railways were designed for a European theatre with short distances and developed infrastructure. They were optimized for speed and comfort, not adaptability. When German forces advanced into Soviet territory, they encountered a railway gauge problem that would plague their entire campaign. Soviet railways used a 1,520mm gauge, while German railways used the standard European 1,435mm gauge. Every captured railway line had to be converted, a process that took weeks and thousands of workers. More critically, German logistics doctrine assumed that conquered territories would provide resources. The systematic Soviet evacuation ensured that advancing German forces captured empty factories and stripped infrastructure. The Germans found themselves occupying an industrial wasteland. The counter-offensive. Logistics as a weapon. When the Soviet counter-offensive began in December 1941, the railway system demonstrated its true strategic value. Soviet forces could redeploy entire armies across thousands of kilometers in days. Fresh troops from Siberia arrived at the Moscow front fully equipped and supplied, a feat that shocked German intelligence. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, later wrote, "We had defeated the Red Army we encountered. We did not understand that the Soviet Union could generate entirely new armies faster than we could destroy them. Their railway system was a strategic weapon we never countered." The Stalingrad operation. Logistical mastery. The defense and counter-offensive at Stalingrad represented the ultimate expression of Soviet railway logistics. Between July 1942 and February 1943, Soviet railways transported 2.5 million soldiers to the Stalingrad sector, 12,000 artillery pieces, 2,300 tanks, 17,000 tons of ammunition daily. All of this moved through a railway network that was under constant German air attack and artillery bombardment. Soviet railway troops developed extraordinary defensive measures. They built dummy rail stations to draw German bombers. They operated repair crews that could replace destroyed track sections in under 2 hours. They created alternative routing systems so complex that even if the Germans destroyed major junctions, trains could be rerouted through secondary and tertiary lines. Personal testimony. Railway Defense Brigade Commander Colonel Sergei Volkov commanded a railway defense brigade tasked with protecting the critical Saratov-Stalingrad rail line. His unit combined traditional military defense with railway engineering. "We were not soldiers who happened to protect railways," he explained in post-war interviews. "We were railway engineers who happened to carry weapons. Our primary mission was keeping the trains moving. Everything else was secondary." Volkov's brigade developed tactics that would become standard in Soviet railway defense. They positioned anti-aircraft batteries directly on railway cars, creating mobile air defense platforms. They trained infantry units in rapid rail repair techniques. They created underground supply depots at regular intervals, ensuring that damaged supply lines could be quickly restored. His brigade suffered 40% casualties during the Stalingrad campaign. The rail line never stopped operating. The Eastern European campaigns. Logistics in advance. As Soviet forces began their advance westward in 1943 to 1944, the railway system demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Soviet railway troops followed advancing armies, converting captured European gauge railways to Soviet standards, repairing bomb damage, and establishing new supply lines, all while maintaining the massive logistics requirements of a multi-front offensive. By 1944, Soviet railways were moving armies across distances that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 moved 2.2 million soldiers and 6,000 tanks over 500 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, a logistical achievement that remains unmatched in military history. The human cost. The railway system's success came at extraordinary human cost. Railway workers had the highest casualty rates of any non-combat Soviet occupation. Between 1941 and 1945, over 200,000 railway workers were killed, more than died in many entire military campaigns. These were not soldiers, they were engineers, dispatchers, maintenance workers, and laborers. They died from air attacks, artillery bombardment, accidents, and exhaustion. Their sacrifice made the entire Soviet war effort possible. The legacy of Soviet railway logistics. When the war ended, military analysts worldwide began studying Soviet railway operations. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about military logistics. The Soviets had proven that a well-designed logistics system could compensate for initial military disadvantages, that systematic planning could overcome seemingly impossible challenges, and that infrastructure could be a strategic weapon as powerful as any tank or aircraft. American military logistics, which had relied on maritime supremacy and motor transport, began incorporating lessons from Soviet railway operations. The concept of logistics as a weapon system, rather than a support function, traces directly to Soviet railway doctrine. The final calculation. By war's end, Soviet railways had transported 19.8 million soldiers, 4,000 railway cars of military equipment, 2.5 billion tons of supplies. These movements occurred across a network that was constantly under attack, through territory that ranged from Arctic tundra to Central Asian deserts, in temperatures that varied from 50 to plus 150 degrees Celsius. The Germans had better tanks, they had better aircraft, they had more experienced commanders, but they never developed a logistics system that could match Soviet railways. In the mathematics of total war, the ability to move resources systematically and at scale proved more decisive than individual technical superiority. Colonel Pavlov, who had stared at that impossible map in October 1941, lived to see Soviet flags raised over Berlin. In his unpublished memoirs, he wrote, "We did not win with better weapons. We won because we could bring more weapons to the fight, faster and more reliably than our enemy. The railway was our secret weapon. The Germans never understood this until it was too late." The trains that had moved those factories in 1941 continued operating long after the war ended. Many of the railway workers who had enabled the Great Evacuation returned to civilian life without recognition or honors. But they had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They had moved an entire industrial civilization while simultaneously fighting a war of annihilation. And in doing so, they had written a new chapter in the mathematics of warfare. Section 2. The Grey Atlantic, Convoy Mathematics and the War Beneath the Waves, March 16, 1943. Western Approaches Command, Liverpool. Commander Peter Gretton stared at a wall-sized map covered with colored pins and string, each representing a convoy or known U-boat position. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Britain imported 60 million tons of supplies annually. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. At current loss rates, Britain would be starved into submission within 18 months. This was not a war that would be decided by heroic naval battles or daring raids. This would be a mathematical equation written in shipping tonnage, loss rates, and convoy efficiency. The side that solved the equation first would win. The other would drown. The foundation of the crisis. The Battle of the Atlantic began not with a declaration or a single engagement, but as a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded across 3 years. When war began in September 1939, Britain's maritime lifelines, the shipping routes that brought food, fuel, and raw materials from North America, became the target of a systematic German campaign to strangle the island nation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, understood something that many traditional naval officers did not. Modern warfare was industrial warfare, and Britain's industry depended entirely on imports. "We do not need to invade Britain," he told his staff in late 1939. "We simply need to sink 750,000 tons of shipping per month. Britain will collapse from economic starvation." The mathematics supported his assessment. Britain required approximately 47 million tons of imports annually to maintain its war economy. This meant roughly 4 million tons per month. If German U-boats could sink even 20% of incoming tonnage consistently, British industrial capacity would begin a death spiral from which recovery would be impossible. The early disasters, 1940–1942. The first 2 years of the Atlantic campaign were catastrophic for Britain. German U-boats, operating in coordinated wolf packs, were sinking Allied merchant ships at rates that exceeded all projections. The statistics tell a brutal story. 1940, 4 million tons of Allied shipping sunk. 1941, 4.3 million tons sunk. 1942, 7.8 million tons sunk. Meanwhile, Allied shipbuilding capacity struggled to replace losses. 1940, 1.6 million tons of new shipping built. 1941, 2.1 million tons built. 1942, 5.3 million tons built. The gap between losses and construction represented more than statistics. Each number represented ships that would never arrive, cargoes lost forever, crews drowned in the cold Atlantic waters. And critically, each loss represented a degradation of Britain's ability to continue the war. The convoy system, an ancient solution to a modern problem. The convoy system itself was not new. Naval forces had been organizing merchant ships into protected groups for centuries, but World War II demanded a level of organizational complexity that had never been attempted. A typical Atlantic convoy consisted of 30–60 merchant ships arranged in columns, protected by 6–10 escort vessels. Each ship had to maintain precise spacing and speed. Communications had to be maintained while observing radio silence. Navigation had to account for varying speeds of different ships while avoiding known U-boat positions. The mathematical complexity was staggering. Captain Arthur Whitworth, who served as a convoy commodore, the senior merchant marine officer coordinating the civilian ships, described the challenge. Imagine trying to move 50 ships, each with different handling characteristics, different speeds, different crews with varying levels of experience, across 3,000 miles of ocean while maintaining formation, avoiding storms, and evading submarines. Now add complete darkness, radio silence, and the knowledge that you're being hunted by an enemy who can strike without warning. This was our daily reality. Personal testimony. Convoy SC-121. The convoy designated SC-121 departed New York on March 6, 1943. With 59 merchant ships, it would become a case study in the brutal mathematics of convoy warfare. Able seaman Robert Morrison served aboard the SS Bonneville, a merchant ship carrying aviation fuel, one of the most dangerous cargoes in the convoy. His account, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, provides stark detail. We understood the mathematics. The more ships in convoy, the harder we were to find. But once found, the more ships in one place meant more targets. We lived with this calculation every day for 14 days as we crossed the Atlantic. SC-121 was intercepted by U-boat Wolfpack Raubgraf on March 10th. Over the next 5 days, 13 ships were sunk, 22% of the convoy. Morrison's ship survived, but he watched 7 other vessels explode or slip beneath the waves. Over 400 merchant seamen died. The lost ships represented 95,000 tons of supplies that would never reach Britain. The mathematical turning point. Operations research enters the war. The solution to the convoy crisis came not from traditional naval tactics, but from a revolutionary application of mathematics to warfare. In 1941, British scientist Patrick Blackett established the Operational Research Section within the Royal Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. Blackett's team approached convoy defense as a pure mathematical problem. They analyzed thousands of convoy reports, U-boat encounter logs, and attack patterns. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about convoy operations. Key findings from Blackett's analysis. 1. The square law of combat. Doubling the size of a convoy did not double the risk. Because U-boats could only attack a limited perimeter, larger convoys were actually more efficient. A convoy of 60 ships required barely more escorts than a convoy of 30 ships, but presented a much harder target to find. 2. The aircraft gap. U-boats were most vulnerable when forced to surface. Analysis showed that convoys with air cover had 80% fewer losses than those without. But there was a critical mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. Closing this gap became an immediate priority. 3. Optimal escort positioning. Traditional naval doctrine placed escorts in a ring around the convoy. Blackett's analysis showed that escorts positioned ahead of the convoy, aggressively hunting U-boats, were far more effective than defensive perimeter patrols. Part 4. The depth charge problem. Standard depth charges were set to explode at 100 feet, but U-boats under attack typically dived to 50-60 feet initially. Changing the depth setting to 25 feet increased kill rates by 400%. These weren't tactical suggestions. They were mathematical proofs that could be implemented immediately. And they were. Personal testimony. The science of survival. Dr. Charles Goodeve, a physicist who worked with Blackett's operations research team, later described the intellectual environment. We were not military men. We were scientists, mathematicians, and statisticians. We approached the convoy problem the way we would approach any scientific problem, by gathering data, identifying patterns, testing hypotheses. The Royal Navy was initially skeptical, but the mathematics were undeniable. Goodeve's team developed the tactical tables, mathematical lookup charts that told escort commanders the optimal positions for their ships based on convoy size, speed, and weather conditions. These tables transformed convoy defense from an art to a science. The technology revolution. Closing the air gap. While operations research provided tactical solutions, technology provided strategic answers. The critical problem was the mid-Atlantic gap, the area roughly 800 miles from either shore where land-based aircraft couldn't provide convoy protection. U-boats learned to operate in this zone with relative impunity. 3 technological solutions emerged. Very long range, VLR, aircraft. Modified B-24 Liberator bombers with extended fuel tanks could reach 200 miles from base, enough to cover the entire Atlantic. By March 1943, VLR squadrons began operating from Iceland, Newfoundland, and Northern Ireland. Escort carriers. Small aircraft carriers that could accompany convoys provided air cover anywhere in the Atlantic. The first escort carriers entered service in 1942, and by 1943, they were transforming convoy operations. Centimetric radar. New 10-centimeter radar sets could detect U-boat periscopes and surfaced submarines far more effectively than earlier systems. Critically, German U-boats had no detection equipment for this radar wavelength. They were effectively blind to its use. The combination of these technologies, guided by operations research principles, transformed the Atlantic battlefield. The turning point, May 1943. May 1943 represents the decisive moment in the Battle of the Atlantic. In that single month, German U-boats sank 34 Allied merchant ships, but lost 41 U-boats. This was an unsustainable loss rate. Dönitz had approximately 230 operational U-boats. At this rate of loss, his entire fleet would be destroyed in 6 months. The mathematics had reversed. Previously, Britain was losing ships faster than they could be built. Now Germany was losing U-boats faster than they could be built. On May 24, 1943, Dönitz withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic, a tacit admission of defeat. Personal testimony. U-boat commander's perspective. Kapitän-Leutnant Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, survived the war and provided extraordinary insight into the U-boat perspective during this period. His memoir offers a stark assessment. By mid-1943, we understood we were no longer hunters. We were being hunted. The Allied convoys had aircraft we could not detect until bombs were falling. They had escort ships that could find us in complete darkness. They had coordination and tactics that we could not counter. We were sending men to die in a battle we could not win. Kremer's U-boat completed 8 patrols between 1941 and 1943. His first 4 patrols, between 1941 and early 1942, sank 13 Allied ships with minimal risk. His last 4 patrols, between late 1942 and mid-1943, sank only 2 ships, and U-333 was depth-charged, damaged, and forced to abort 3 different patrols. The mathematical reality of the changing battle was viscerally clear to those living through it. The Industrial War. Liberty ships. While tactics and technology were crucial, the ultimate solution to the Atlantic crisis was industrial, specifically the American Liberty Ship Program. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist with no shipbuilding experience, applied mass production principles to ship construction with revolutionary results. Traditional shipbuilding treated each vessel as a custom product. Liberty ships were modular, standardized, and built using assembly line techniques. The results were extraordinary. Traditional construction time for a cargo ship: 6 to 8 months. Liberty ship average construction time: 42 days. Record construction time: SS Robert E. Peary: 4 days, 15.5 hours. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 2,110 Liberty ships, 18 million tons of shipping capacity. This industrial tsunami overwhelmed German U-boat capacity. Even at peak efficiency, U-boats could not sink ships as fast as American yards could build them. Personal testimony: Liberty ship welder. Margaret Silver worked as a welder at the Kaiser Richmond shipyard in California. Her account provides insight into the human dimension of this industrial miracle. We built ships the way Ford built cars. I was responsible for welding a specific section of the hull. I did the same welds on the same type of section on ship after ship. I could do my job in my sleep, and we all worked like this. Specialists doing one task perfectly, over and over. We weren't craftsmen. We were industrial workers, and we were winning the war. Silver's shipyard employed over 90,000 workers at peak production. They launched a completed Liberty ship every 5 days. The German U-boat fleet, at its maximum strength, numbered 240 operational boats. The mathematical impossibility of the German situation became clear. Even if every U-boat sank a ship every patrol, they could not keep pace with Allied construction. The escort carrier revolution. While Liberty ships addressed the supply problem, escort carriers solved the tactical problem. These small aircraft carriers, many converted from merchant ships, provided convoys with organic air support anywhere in the Atlantic. HMS Biter, one of the first British escort carriers, entered service in early 1943. Commander John Cassels, who commanded her air group, described the tactical transformation. Before escort carriers, convoys were blind. We could only react to U-boat attacks. With carrier aircraft, we could patrol ahead of the convoy, detect U-boats before they reached attack positions, and force them underwater where they were slow and ineffective. We transformed convoy defense from reactive to proactive. Cassels' squadron flew an average of 30 sorties per day during convoy protection duty. They sank 3 U-boats directly and forced dozens of others to abort attacks. More importantly, their presence made U-boat operations nearly impossible. A surfaced U-boat could cross the Atlantic in 2 weeks. A submerged U-boat, running on batteries at slow speed to avoid detection, took over 8 weeks. Escort carriers forced U-boats to remain submerged, dramatically reducing their operational effectiveness. The human cost. The Atlantic victory came at extraordinary cost. Merchant seamen had one of the highest casualty rates of any service. British merchant seamen, 30,248 killed, 14.7% of total. Allied merchant seamen, total, 72,000 plus killed. Ships sunk, 3,500 merchant ships, 175 warships, U-boat crews, 28,000 killed, 75% of all U-boat personnel. These statistics represent more than military casualties. Merchant seamen were civilians serving in war zones. They had no weapons, minimal training, and faced an enemy that struck without warning from beneath the waves. When a torpedo struck an oil tanker, crews had seconds to abandon ship before the fuel ignited. In winter, Atlantic conditions, survival time in the water was measured in minutes. Personal testimony. Survival. Third Officer Charles Lightoller served aboard multiple merchant ships throughout the war. He survived 3 sinkings. His account provides brutal clarity about merchant marine survival. When the torpedo hits, you have perhaps 15 seconds to reach the deck. If you're below, you're probably dead. If you make it to the deck, you have perhaps 30 seconds before the ship begins to go down. If you reach the water, you have between 3 and 7 minutes before hypothermia renders you unconscious. If you're lucky, an escort vessel might pick you up. If not, you drown. These were the mathematics of merchant service. Lightoller survived because, in his words, I was extraordinarily lucky 3 times. He returned to sea after each sinking. When asked why, his response was simple. The convoys had to get through. Someone had to crew the ships. I was alive. I went back. The strategic impact. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won. U-boats continued operations until war's end, but they never again threatened Britain's maritime lifelines. The impact of this victory was profound. Enabled D-Day. The Normandy invasion required shipping 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles to Britain for staging. Without control of Atlantic shipping lanes, this concentration would have been impossible. Sustained Soviet resistance. Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union traveled primarily by Arctic convoy routes. Between 1941 and 1945, these convoys delivered 18,700 aircraft, 12,000 tanks, and 427,000 trucks. Maintained British war economy. With Atlantic routes secure, British industrial production increased throughout 1943-1945, despite continued German bombing. The final accounting. When the war ended, the statistics told a story of mathematical warfare at its most brutal. Total Allied merchant ships sunk, 3,500, 14.5 million gross tons. Total Allied merchant ships built, 8,000 plus, 50 plus million gross tons. Total U-boats built, 156. Total U-boats lost. 783, U-boat crew survival rate. 25%. The Atlantic battle was won not through heroic naval engagements or brilliant tactical maneuvers, but through systematic application of mathematical analysis to warfare. Operations research identified optimal tactics. Industrial production overwhelmed enemy capacity. Technology closed tactical gaps. Admiral Sir Max Horton, who commanded Western approaches, the British Convoy Coordination Centre, from 1942 to 1945, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment. We did not win the Atlantic through superior courage or skill, though our men showed extraordinary amounts of both. We won through superior mathematics. We calculated better, produced more efficiently, and coordinated more systematically than our enemy. In industrial warfare, this was sufficient. The Grey Atlantic, which had threatened to become Britain's grave, became instead a highway for the largest military-industrial operation in history. The convoys got through, Britain survived, and the mathematical principles developed in this desperate maritime campaign would reshape military logistics for generations to come. Section 3. The Calculated Storm, Strategic Bombing and the Birth of Operations. Research, August 17, 1943. High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire. RAF Bomber, Command Headquarters. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett stared at aerial reconnaissance photographs showing Schweinfurt, Germany. The ball-bearing factories there produced 40% of German ball-bearing production, a critical bottleneck in Nazi war production. The Americans were planning a deep penetration raid with 300 B-17 bombers. Bennett's statistical models predicted 25 to 30% losses. The raid would proceed anyway. This was the mathematics of strategic bombing. Calculate acceptable losses, identify critical targets, measure results in destroyed industrial capacity. The mathematics were brutal. They were also the key to winning the war. The theory of strategic bombing. The concept of strategic bombing, using aircraft to destroy an enemy's industrial capacity rather than just battlefield targets, emerged in the interwar period. Theorists like Italy's Giulio Douhet and America's Billy Mitchell argued that air power could win wars independently of ground forces by destroying an enemy's ability to produce weapons. By 1939, both Britain and the United States had built significant strategic bombing forces based on these theories. But theory confronted reality quickly and violently. Early bombing raids were catastrophically ineffective. The brutal learning curve, 1940-1942, RAF Bomber Command, began the war with confidence in precision daylight bombing. This confidence died quickly. German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses made daylight raids prohibitively costly. Bomber Command shifted to night operations, but night bombing accuracy was abysmal. In August 1941, British analyst D.M. Butt prepared a statistical study of bombing effectiveness that shocked military leadership. The Butt report analyzed over 4,000 raid photographs and reached devastating conclusions. Only 33% of crews claiming to hit targets actually dropped bombs within 5 miles of the target. Over heavily defended targets, only 10% of bombs fell within 5 miles. Moonless nights saw only 7% of bombs land within 5 miles. Squadron leader Charles Patterson, a veteran bomber pilot, described the reality. "We were flying through hell, fighters, flak, searchlights, dropping bombs that statistically were landing in empty fields. Men were dying to achieve effectively nothing. We needed a completely different approach." The birth of operational research. The solution came not from military commanders, but from scientists applying mathematical analysis to warfare. Professor Patrick Blackett, the same Blackett who revolutionized anti-submarine warfare, established operational research sections within RAF Bomber Command and later the U.S. Army Air Forces. The operations research teams asked fundamental questions. What is the optimal force size for different target types? What route minimizes losses while maximizing target time? Which targets provide maximum impact on enemy production? What are acceptable loss rates for different strategic objectives? These weren't philosophical questions. They were mathematical problems requiring empirical solutions based on data analysis. Personal testimony, Dr. Freeman Dyson. Dr. Freeman Dyson, a brilliant young mathematician, joined RAF Bomber Command's Operational Research Section in 1943. His work would save thousands of lives and fundamentally reshape strategic bombing doctrine. Dyson analyzed bomber loss statistics and identified a critical error in RAF tactics. Bomber command doctrine required aircraft to fly straight and level for the final bombing run, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire for crucial seconds. Dyson's analysis showed this procedure accounted for the majority of bombers lost over targets. The mathematics were clear, Dyson later wrote. Those few seconds of straight and level flight increased loss rates by 30–40%. I calculated that if we accepted a 2–3% reduction in bombing accuracy by allowing evasive action during the bomb run, We would save hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives. The RAF implemented Dyson's recommendation. Loss rates dropped immediately. Dyson's analysis represented operations research at its purest, applying mathematical rigor to identify and solve problems that conventional military thinking missed. Target selection. The bottleneck theory. American operations researchers developed the bottleneck theory of strategic bombing. Identify critical components that, if destroyed, would cascade through the entire industrial system. Ball bearings represented the perfect bottleneck target. Every tank, aircraft, truck, and machine tool required them. Germany had limited ball bearing production capacity, concentrated in a few locations. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943 tested this theory catastrophically. The Schweinfurt raids, mathematical reality meets combat. On August 17, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched 230 B-17 bombers against Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. No fighter escort could reach the target. The distance exceeded fighter range. The bombers would face German fighters and flak alone. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the raid, understood the mathematics. We need to destroy 40% of productive capacity to have strategic impact. We can expect 25% losses. These are acceptable numbers for the strategic value of the target. The raid destroyed an estimated 38% of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production. The cost, 36 bombers shot down, 60 more damaged beyond repair, a 42% loss rate. Over 500 airmen killed or captured. A follow-up raid on October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, saw 60 of 291 bombers shot down, a 20% loss rate. These losses were mathematically unsustainable. At these rates, the entire strategic bombing force would be destroyed before achieving decisive results. Personal testimony. B-17. Survivor Lieutenant. Robert Morgan piloted the B-17 Memphis Belle on 25 missions over Europe, including deep penetration raids without fighter escort. His account captures the psychological reality of operating in what crews called the killing zone. Every mission, we calculated our odds. If the loss rate was 5%, you had roughly even chances of completing a 25-mission tour. At 10%, your chances dropped to 1 in 10. On raids like Schweinfurt, with 20% plus losses, the mathematics became existential. Most of us wouldn't survive. We flew anyway. Morgan's entire crew survived their tour, a statistical anomaly they were aware of. Of the 12,731 B-17s built, 4,735 were lost in combat, a 37% loss rate. For the men flying them, operational research statistics weren't abstract academic exercises. They were life-and-death calculations made before every mission. The fighter solution, P-51 Mustang. The Schweinfurt disasters proved that unescorted deep penetration raids were mathematically impossible. The solution required technological innovation, long-range fighter escorts. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could escort bombers to any target in Germany and return. Its introduction in late 1943 transformed the strategic bombing campaign. Operations research teams calculated optimal fighter-to-bomber ratios, escort tactics, and combat patterns. Major James Howard, who earned the Medal of Honor flying P-51 escort missions, described the transformation. Before long-range fighters, bomber crews flew into Germany expecting to die. After P-51s began escort duty, the mathematics changed. Losses dropped from 20% to 3 to 4%. The Germans couldn't maintain fighter forces large enough to overwhelm both bombers and their escorts. The statistical impact was immediate. January 1944, limited P-51 escort, 11.3% bomber loss rate. March 1944, full P-51 escort, 3.9% bomber loss rate. June 1944, air superiority achieved, 1.4% bomber loss rate. Target. Analysis, what actually worked? Post-war analysis revealed surprising truths about strategic bombing effectiveness. Some of the most heavily bombed targets had minimal strategic impact. Other targets, attacked almost as afterthoughts, proved devastatingly effective. Oil, the critical target. German oil production proved to be the true strategic bottleneck. Germany produced approximately 6 million tons of oil annually, barely sufficient for military needs. Synthetic oil plants, which produced 50% of German fuel, were concentrated, vulnerable, and difficult to replace. When the U.S. 8th Air Force shifted focus to oil targets in mid-1944, results were dramatic. May 1944, 156,000 tons of aviation fuel produced. September 1944, 10,000 tons produced. March 1945, 1,000 tons produced. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later testified. The oil campaign was the decisive factor. We could replace destroyed tanks and aircraft. We couldn't replace fuel. By late 1944, we had aircraft that couldn't fly and tanks that couldn't move, not from lack of vehicles, but from lack of fuel. Transportation, the system target. Operations researchers identified transportation networks as system-level targets. Destroying marshalling yards, rail bridges, and canal systems didn't eliminate specific weapons production. It degraded the entire industrial ecosystem. The Transportation Plan, implemented before D-Day, systematically destroyed French and Belgian rail networks. By June 6, 1944, German forces in France faced paralyzed logistics. Reinforcement divisions took weeks instead of days to reach Normandy. Ammunition and fuel couldn't reach frontline units. The invasion succeeded partly because German defenders couldn't maneuver effectively. Personal testimony. Operations research analyst Dr. Charles Hitch, an economist who worked with U.S. Army Air Force's operations research teams, reflected on target selection methodology. We treated the German economy as a system of interconnected components. Our mathematical models identified which nodes, if destroyed, would cascade throughout the system. Oil and transportation emerged as critical nodes. Destroying them didn't just eliminate production, it degraded the entire industrial ecosystem's ability to function. Hitch's teams developed input-output models of German industry that predicted the systemic effects of destroying different target types. These models, primitive by modern standards, represented the first attempts to quantify industrial interdependence and weaponize that understanding. The moral calculus, area bombing, British Bomber Command, unable to hit precision targets at night, adopted area bombing, attacking entire industrial cities rather than specific factories. This strategy, associated with Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, remains controversial. The operational research justification was mathematical. If precision bombing succeeded 10% of the time, area bombing of industrial cities succeeded 80% of the time in hitting something militarily relevant. The moral cost, massive civilian casualties, was subordinated to military effectiveness calculations. The raid on Hamburg, July 1943, killed approximately 42,000 civilians and destroyed 250,000 homes. The raid on Dresden, February 1945, killed 25,000 to 35,000 civilians. These weren't accidents. They were the intended outcome of a strategy that treated industrial cities as legitimate targets. Squadron leader Miles Tripp, who flew on the Hamburg raid, wrestled with the moral implications. We were told we were attacking shipyards and U-boat facilities. We knew we were destroying a city and everyone in it. The official line was that German workers were part of the war economy. We burned them alive. I completed my tour. I carry those missions with me still. The moral question. Unresolved operations research provided mathematical rigor to strategic bombing, but it couldn't resolve the fundamental moral question: were the civilian casualties justified by military necessity? This question haunts strategic bombing history. German civilian deaths from strategic bombing, 350,000, 400,000. German industrial production impact, Production peaked in 1944 despite bombing strategic effectiveness. Debatable until oil on transportation campaigns of late 1944. Defenders argue strategic bombing diverted German resources. 1 million personnel in air defense, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. Destroyed crucial bottleneck industries and made the invasion of Europe possible. Critics argue the same resources applied to tactical air support would have been more effective with far fewer civilian casualties. The mathematics could calculate optimal bombing patterns. They couldn't answer whether those patterns should be employed. The Strategic Bombing Survey, Post-War Analysis. After the war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, conducted comprehensive analysis of bombing effectiveness. The findings challenged many wartime assumptions. Key findings. German war production peaked in 1944 despite 3 years of strategic bombing. Area bombing of cities had minimal impact on industrial production. Precision bombing of oil and transportation targets was decisively effective. Bombing's psychological impact on German morale was negligible. Bombing diverted massive German resources to air defense. The survey concluded, strategic bombing was essential to Allied victory, but not in the way theorists predicted. It succeeded by forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense and by destroying critical bottleneck industries, oil transportation, not by breaking German morale or eliminating general industrial capacity. Personal testimony, German perspective. Albert Speer, in post-war interrogations, provided crucial German perspective on bombing effectiveness. Until mid-1944, we could compensate for bombing damage. German production actually increased through 1943 and early 1944 despite heavy raids. The turning point came when Allied bombers shifted to oil and transportation. These attacks we couldn't counter. By late 1944, lack of fuel paralyzed our military. Had the Allies focused on these targets from the beginning, the war would have ended months earlier. The legacy of strategic bombing. The operations research methods developed for strategic bombing had profound peacetime applications. The analytical techniques, system analysis, optimization theory, statistical modeling became foundations of modern management science and economics. The moral questions remain unresolved. Strategic bombing established the precedent that civilian industrial capacity is a legitimate military target, a principle that shaped Cold War nuclear doctrine and continues to influence modern warfare ethics. The final calculation. By war's end, Allied strategic bombing forces had dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on European targets. The campaign cost U.S. Army Air Forces 26,000 aircraft lost, 40,000 personnel killed. RAF bomber. Command, 12,000 aircraft lost, 55,000 personnel killed. German civilians, 350,000, 400,000 killed. These losses brought strategic advantages that were real but difficult to quantify precisely. Did strategic bombing shorten the war by 6 months, a year, 2 years? The mathematics of causation in war are imprecise. What's clear is that strategic bombing represented the first attempt to wage industrial warfare systematically through applied mathematics. Operations research teams transformed bombing from a blunt instrument to a calculated weapon. The human cost of those calculations, both among bomber crews and German civilians, represents one of the most troubling chapters in the mathematical history of warfare. The storms that raged over Germany were not natural phenomena. They were calculated, planned, and executed according to mathematical principles. The fact that we can now calculate their effectiveness doesn't resolve whether they should have been unleashed. That question remains, a calculation without a clear answer, a mathematics of war that transcends pure numbers into the realm of moral philosophy. Section 4. The Invisible Shield. Radar in the Battle of Britain, July 10, 1940. RAF Fighter Command Headquarters, Bentley Priory. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stared at a large plotting table where young women pushed markers representing incoming German aircraft. The Luftwaffe was launching its largest air attack yet. Over 70 bombers escorted by fighters. Traditional air defense required standing patrols, consuming vast amounts of fuel and pilot energy. Dowding had something revolutionary, a mathematical approach to air defense built on a technology barely understood by his own pilots. This would be the first battle in history won by a systematic integration of technology, mathematics, and human coordination. The technology was radar. The mathematics were interception calculations and resource optimization. The human coordination was a command and control system unprecedented in warfare. The Germans had more aircraft, but Dowding had mathematics on his side. The foundation, Chain Home. Britain's radar network, designated Chain Home, consisted of 30 stations along the English coast, each capable of detecting aircraft at ranges up to 120 miles. This provided 20 to 30 minutes of warning, barely enough time to scramble fighters, climb to altitude, and intercept. The physics of radar were recent. The word radar itself, radio detection and ranging, wouldn't be coined until 1940. British scientists had developed the technology in utmost secrecy between 1935 and 1939. By September 1939, the Chain Home network was operational. The Germans knew the towers existed. They didn't understand their function or significance. Dr. Robert Watson-Watt, who led Chain Home development, understood that the technology alone wasn't sufficient. "Radar gives us information," he told Dowding in 1939. "But information is worthless without a system to process it, analyze it, and act on it in real time. We need to build an entire command structure around radar detection." The Dowding system. Mathematics in action. Dowding created something unprecedented, an integrated air defense system that combined radar detection, visual observation, communications networks, and fighter control into a unified whole. The system operated as follows. 1. Detection. Chain Home radar and observer corps, visual spotters detected incoming aircraft. 2. Filtration. Specialized personnel at filter rooms eliminated duplicate reports and false readings. 3. Plotting. Processed information appeared on plotting tables at Fighter Command headquarters and sector stations. 4. Decision. Controllers assessed threats and allocated fighter resources. 5. Interception. Ground controllers guided fighters to optimal interception positions. 6. Engagement. Pilots completed intercepts and returned to base for rearming. The entire process, from detection to interception, took 15-20 minutes. This was combat, fought at the speed of information processing. Personal testimony. Radar operator, WAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Corporal Vera Richardson operated Chain Home radar at Poling Station on the Sussex coast. Her account provides crucial insight into the human dimension of radar operations. We stared at cathode ray tubes showing green lines that represented aircraft. We estimated altitude by signal strength, counted numbers by analyzing the return patterns. This was mathematics done under enormous pressure. Every second mattered. If we miscalculated altitude or numbers, our fighters might intercept at the wrong height or be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Richardson worked 8-hour shifts in windowless concrete bunkers, tracking German formations across the Channel. On August 18, 1940, her station was bombed and partially destroyed. She and her crew continued operations throughout the attack, providing crucial raid warning until the station lost power. Her citation for bravery, noted, maintained operations under direct attack, providing raid information that enabled successful interception. The mathematics of interception, fighter interception, was a three-dimensional mathematical problem solved in real time under combat conditions. Controllers needed to calculate Current position and heading of enemy aircraft. Fighter scramble. Time from readiness state. Climb rate and time to optimal intercept altitude. Closing speeds and intercept geometry. Fuel state and time on station for fighters. Squadron leader Thomas Gleave, a sector controller, described the mathematical intensity. We were solving differential equations in our heads, while enemy bombers approached at 200 mph. Calculate wrong, and our fighters intercept empty sky while bombers reach their targets. Calculate right, and we place Hurricanes and Spitfires in perfect attack positions. Controllers used mechanical calculating devices and pre-computed tables, but much of the work required mental arithmetic performed under extreme pressure. A typical intercept problem: enemy raid detected 80 miles away at 15,000 feet, heading 200 to 70 degrees at 100 EOT centimeters. Friendly fighters at readiness, 2-minute scramble. Need 12 minutes to climb to 20,000 feet. Calculate optimal scramble timing and vector. Solution required accounting for wind, likely enemy course changes, friendly aircraft performance, and maintaining fighters in position for sustained patrol. Controllers made dozens of these calculations daily during the battle's height. The resource optimization problem. Dowding faced a brutal resource constraint. RAF Fighter Command had approximately 700 operational fighters at the battle's start. The Luftwaffe had over 2,600 aircraft. In a battle of attrition, Germany would win. Dowding's solution was mathematical. Optimize resource allocation to force the Germans to fight on terms disadvantageous to them. Key principles. Principle 1. Never commit all forces to single engagement. Standing patrols consumed enormous resources. Radar allowed fighters to remain on ground until needed, maximizing availability. Principle 2. Prioritize bomber interception. Fighters attacking fighters achieved tactical victories but didn't protect Britain. Fighters attacking bombers achieved strategic objectives. Dowding instructed pilots to ignore German fighter escorts and focus on bombers whenever possible. Principle 3. Preserve pilot strength. Aircraft could be replaced in weeks. Trained pilots took months to replace. Dowding refused to commit fighters to hopeless battles, accepting some successful German raids rather than risk catastrophic pilot losses. These principles were mathematically sound, but politically difficult. Churchill and others wanted aggressive fighter sweeps over France. Dowding refused, understanding that such operations would destroy fighter command without strategic benefit. Personal testimony. Fighter Pilot Squadron. Leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron, flew throughout the Battle of Britain. His memoir captures the pilot perspective on Dowding's system. We lived by radar and ground control. We'd scramble, climb hard, and hear the controller's voice. Hostile formation, Angels 15 bearing 20 miles. We'd adjust heading, climb angle, and arrive precisely positioned for attack. This coordination was extraordinary. We weren't just flying fighters. We were part of a larger machine, a system that included radar operators, controllers, and plotters. We were the visible part, but the system was the weapon. Townsend survived the battle, credited with 7 confirmed kills. He attributed his survival to the system. German pilots flew predetermined patrol patterns. We flew to intercept specific threats detected by radar. This made us more efficient and more likely to survive. Every sortie had a purpose. We weren't just flying patrols hoping to encounter the enemy. The German perspective. Fighting blind. The Luftwaffe understood Britain had early warning capabilities, but never grasped the sophistication of the integrated system. German fighters flew standing patrols that exhausted pilots and consumed fuel. German bombers flew without knowing whether RAF fighters were airborne or where they might attack from. General Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, described the frustration. We could never catch the British fighters on the ground. They always seemed to be airborne, at altitude, waiting for us. We didn't understand they had a complete picture of our formations while we flew blind. This asymmetry was decisive. German intelligence reports from the period show they identified chain home towers, but never understood their function properly. Some German analysts believed they were early warning devices. None understood they were part of an integrated command and control system that gave Britain effective force multiplication. The critical period, August-September 1940. The battle reached crisis in late August 1940. The Luftwaffe shifted to attacking RAF airfields and radar stations, nearly achieving strategic success. Between August 24th and September 6th, the Germans damaged 7 sector airfields and destroyed 5 chain home stations. Fighter command pilot losses reached unsustainable rates. 120 pilots killed or seriously wounded in 2 weeks. Dowding calculated that at current attrition rates, fighter command would lose effective operational capacity within 3 weeks. Personal testimony. Ground Crew Flight Sergeant James Lacey served as a Hurricane crew chief at Biggin Hill during this critical period. His account provides ground-level perspective. The airfield was bombed 5 times in 3 days. We worked in crater-filled fields patching damaged Hurricanes. We'd get an aircraft serviceable. It would fly a sortie, return damaged, and we'd patch it again. We worked 20-hour days. Some aircraft flew 4 sorties in a single day with different pilots. We were exhausted. The pilots were exhausted, but we kept going because stopping meant losing. Biggin Hill's operations room was destroyed on August 30th. Controllers operated from a requisitioned shop in Biggin Hill village, coordinating fighters by telephone while bombs fell. The sector remained operational. The German mistake. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe made a strategic error that saved Britain. They shifted from attacking fighter command infrastructure to bombing London. Hitler, enraged by RAF raids on Berlin, demanded immediate retaliation. From a mathematical perspective, this was catastrophic for Germany. Attacking London required German fighters to operate at extreme range, reducing time over target. It gave fighter command time to repair damaged airfields and radar stations. Most critically, it changed the equation from a war of attrition against fighter command infrastructure to a battle against the entire RAF. Dowding, later, wrote, "Had the Germans continued attacking our airfields and sector stations for another week, we would have been in serious difficulty. Their shift to London saved us." The statistics of victory. The battle officially ended on October 31st, 1940, with RAF Fighter Command victorious. The statistics tell the story. Aircraft losses. Luftwaffe, 187 aircraft, approximately 1/3 of their frontline strength. RAF, 15147 aircraft, replaced by production. Pilot losses. Luftwaffe, 2,662 aircrew killed or captured. RAF, 544 pilots killed. The asymmetry in pilot losses was decisive. Britain could replace aircraft faster than Germany. More critically, Britain preserved its pilot cadre, while Germany suffered unsustainable aircrew attrition. Personal testimony. The few flying officer, Geoffrey Wellham, one of the youngest pilots to serve in the battle, reflected on the experience decades later. We were the few. Churchill's phrase for us. But we weren't alone. For every pilot, there were dozens of radar operators, ground controllers, plotters, mechanics, armorers. They were the invisible many who made our missions possible. The radar system, the control network, the ground crews, they were as much the few as we were. We just happened to be the visible part. Wellham flew over 50 combat sorties during the battle. He survived by luck, skill, and the system that guided him to intercepts and brought him home. The technological legacy chain. Home technology seems primitive by modern standards. The radar sets use giant fixed antennas, had poor resolution, and couldn't detect altitude accurately. But they provided the crucial capability: early warning integrated into a command system. The Dowding system's true innovation wasn't the technology. It was the systematic integration of technology, human decision-making, and communications into a unified whole. This was the template for every modern air defense system. NORAD, the Soviet PVO Strany, and modern integrated air defense systems all trace their conceptual ancestry to Dowding's creation. The human cost of mathematics. The mathematics that saved Britain came with human costs that statistics don't capture. Radar operators worked in bunkers under constant threat of bombing. Controllers made decisions that sent pilots to live or die. Pilots flew missions knowing they were outnumbered, but trusting the system that guided them. WAF Sergeant Elizabeth Mortimer operated the plotting table at Bentley Priory throughout the battle. Her daughter, in a 1990 interview, shared her mother's perspective. She never talked about it as mathematics or technology. She talked about boys, pilots barely 20 years old, who she tracked on missions. She'd watch their markers move across the plotting table, engage enemy formations, and sometimes disappear. She carried those losses personally. The technology made their missions possible. It didn't make their deaths easier to bear. The final calculation. The Battle of Britain proved that systematic integration of technology and human coordination could defeat superior numbers. The mathematics were simple: early warning plus optimized resource allocation plus coordinated command and control equaled force multiplication. But the victory wasn't won by mathematics alone. It required radar operators who stayed at their posts during bombing attacks, controllers who made split-second decisions under incredible pressure, pilots who flew multiple sorties daily despite exhaustion and fear, ground crews who repaired damaged aircraft in bomb-cratered fields. The Dowding system provided the framework. Humans made it work. Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was referring to the fighter pilots. He might equally have been referring to the radar operators, controllers, plotters, and ground crews whose invisible work made those fighters effective. The mathematics saved Britain. The people behind the mathematics made victory possible. Together, they wrote the first chapter in the history of information warfare, the understanding that superior information, processing, and coordination can overcome superior numbers. The chain home towers are mostly gone now, demolished as obsolete shortly after the war. But the concept they enabled, integrated air defense built on early warning, systematic coordination, and optimized resource allocation, remains fundamental to modern military operations. The battle was won on plotting tables, in radar bunkers, and over the radio waves connecting controllers to pilots. The sky over Britain was a battlefield, but the decisive engagements happened in the invisible realm of information, calculation, and systematic coordination. This was warfare transformed by mathematics, technology, and human ingenuity working together. And it was enough.